parallelisms really are the major artistic element of Hebrew poetry. And so we're going to spend the rest of the lecture really defining what we mean by parallelisms and looking at the various kinds of parallelisms and examples of them, so that I can really model how you would read a poem. So let's start off by just defining a parallelism. A broad definition could be something like what I have here. Parallelism is the poetic phenomenon where two or more lines reinforce or refine one another. Essentially what that means is you've got a poem with all these various lines. Well, the idea in those lines is somehow going to reinforce or refine, either by contrast or in some way. They're going to work together artistically to modify each other. And the fact that you've got these various statements doing that is called a parallelism. And so anyway, that's what a parallelism is, the most basic definition. And I want to give you a preliminary example. Here you have Psalm 1:6. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Here you have two lines, and a parallelism could be between between two lines to 5 or 6. Usually it's 2 to 4, but it could be 6 or more. The first line is this positive idea of the Lord knowing or guiding or protecting the way of the righteous. The second line is the idea of the wicked perishing. So you can see how they're refining each other. On the one hand, the Lord protects the way of the righteous. On the other, the way of the wicked will perish. So you've got this positive, negative, wicked versus righteous, perishing versus knowing or caring from the Lord. That's a parallelism. You've got two lines and they're refining each other in some way. Now, there are various kinds of parallelisms. In Intro to Biblical Literature, they define 3 categories. I like the 3 categories in the way they present them, but I am going to give you different examples, and I'm going to call them something other than what they call them. They use these terms: A equals B, A is greater than B, A is less than B. I'm not going to use those throughout this lecture. Instead, I'm just going to call them something that's more descriptive. So instead of saying A equals B, I'm going to call it an interchangeable parallel, or a qualifying parallel, or a parallel of expansion. So anyway, that's why I've got these in red, because this is what the author calls it, and I'm going to use this language, which is a little more helpful, I think. Anyway, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of the different categories of parallelisms, and then we'll actually take time and go through each one in just a bit. First, you have A equals B, or what I call interchangeable parallelisms, and that is where A and B, or the first and second line, are on equal footing and they're interchangeable. You can remove one or remove the second, and the two lines are on equal footing, some way refining each other. The second type of parallel is A states an idea and B qualifies it. So they're not interchangeable, they're not on equal footing. The first statement says something, and then the second statement qualifies it. So it either says when or why or for what purpose. Somehow qualifies the statement begun in A, or in the first line. The third category is where the first line, A, starts or introduces an idea, and then B, or the following lines, expand on it in some sense or complete it in some way. So these are the 3 basic categories of parallelism. Now, I know I went through that real fast and I haven't really defined what those means. At this point, all I'm asking you to know is a really vague concept that there are 3 types of parallelisms, and generally that they're on equal footing, one's qualifying the other, or that they're expanding. Now let's go and really get an in-depth idea of what these parallels are. Now, warning, when you're reading poetry, the goal isn't to classify all the lines. So the goal of poetry isn't to sit there and say, oh, this is a parallel of expansion or a parallelism of contrast. That's not the purpose of poetry. That's not our goal. Our real goal is to appreciate it. So I know I've given you these different categories and I've defined them. One of the big mistakes that beginning students do, and especially when they're teaching poetry, is that they sit around, this Bible study and they go through in Bible study and say, oh, this is a parallel of expansion, this is a parallel of contrast or antithesis or what have you, and all you do is classify them. That's not the goal. In fact, even if you read a poem and you don't know what the various parallelisms are, that's okay. Because really the ultimate goal in understanding poetry is to appreciate it, is to know what the author is doing, how he's using the imagery, and then to appreciate it. So don't get hung up on these definitions I'm about to give you. Instead, notice how the author uses language and retain that aspect. So learn how the author is communicating, and then just learn to pick up how the author communicates in Psalms. So when you're reading, try and identify how the author's doing it. You don't necessarily have to classify it. So anyway, that's just like a little beginning warning there. So let's take a look at the first type of parallelism. We said that there was the first major category was called interchangeable parallelisms. Within that category, there are different kinds. So I know that can get kind of confusing, but that's the idea. There's this category and different kinds within that category. So here's the first interchangeable parallelism is called an echo. And basically it means when you've got two statements that are on equal footing, they're interchangeable, and they're essentially saying the same thing. This is Jesus' teaching. Remember I said that Hebrew poetry has a major influence in the New Testament. Well, here's Jesus speaking in a parallelism when he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Now, these are two interchangeable. You can remove either one of these and it makes sense. But they're also saying the same thing. So it's an interchangeable echo. This is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think I have to go into that. But sometimes that's the extent of what the author's trying to do.